And welcome back. The National Center for Law and Economic Justice is a group of advocates and lawyers that have been fighting for over 5 decades, ensuring that economic, racial, and disability justice are within reach for all individuals and families. Now, they leverage high impact litigation, policy advocacy, and grassroots support to tackle systemic barriers and drive meaningful change. Joining me now to share more is the Executive Director at the National Center for Law and Economic Justice. We thank Dennis Parker for being with us, and good to have you here with us.
My pleasure to be here.
Thank you. The work is steady, huh?
It's steady and growing. There are a lot of the problems we face are ones that are increasing, and actually I was interested in the overlap between the previous conversation. We face deficits in budgets for a lot of the basic services for survival, and a lot of what we do is fighting to assure that survival and the opportunity to thrive.
Yeah, and having those services and having that money there to be able to do that is really of critical nature. When we talk about litigation and the work that you're doing with litigation, there's a lot of stuff out there that's needed for justice, and justice comes in so many different ways. And I, often ask people what social justice is, and they say, I can go on and on and on. But from your perspective, when you talk about justice, how do you see it?
Well, litigation is just one tool of achieving justice, and justice is making sure that everyone has an equal opportunity, has the basics that they need to survive. We use litigation that affects, in many cases, hundreds of thousands of people to make sure that they're able to feed their families, for example. When we're one of the things that we face all over the country, and we have cases from Alaska to New York, although 40% of our work is here in New York City. But we find that even the basic things like being able to feed your family, there are barriers like the offices that are supposed to administer programs being understaffed, or the only way you could apply is through a telephone call where you wait online for as long as 1 or 2 days to even reach another person. And in the meantime, your family is starving. And so we want to make sure that people aren't starving. We want to make sure that if you work, that you get a fair wage. We want to make sure that you live in a safe environment. We want to make sure that you have the opportunity that is your right. And so we try to take steps to make that possible. And we work with the people who are most affected as largely lawyers, although we have people who do outreach to communities and things like that. We work for our clients. We are not the ones who are determining what needs to be done. We speak to them, they tell us, and we try to help them to do it.
Yeah, we talk about high-end litigation, and there's a high-impact litigation, I should say, and there's some high-impact litigation that's out there. When I look at what's going on right now, and you talk about justice as litigation is a form of justice, sometimes litigation is the only way that you can get somebody to the table to even achieve justice.
It is one tool that can do that, but I want to emphasize that, if you look at the civil rights movement, litigation was part of it, but a lot of the advances that were made were what was going on in the streets and in communities. And so I don't want to take more credit than we as lawyers deserve. But it's difficult, and it's a ponderous system. We have cases we've been working on for 10, 20 years, and we're still in court, and we're still monitoring, and we're still fighting. We have cases against the New York City Housing Authority and mold remediation that has been going on. And in the meantime, there are children who are exposed to mold. There are asthma rates that are astronomical in New York, worse than they are in just about any other part of the world. And that shouldn't be happening in this center of wealth.
Yeah, it's a lot. As we look at some of the things that are going on in society right now, I know that one of the things that I can really lay hold on is that of the disabled community. There's been tremendous ground that's been, made and traction made in disability rights. From your perspective, let's talk about that for a moment, disability rights and how you see things.
Disability rights is a large part of what we do, and there has been a lot of progress, but there's still progress to be made. A lot of our work comes from the fact that disabled people cannot get equal access to the benefits that we're fighting for, and that the agencies that oversee these programs don't make the accommodations that are necessary. And part of the problem isn't that there aren't laws, because there are a multitude of anti-discrimination against people with a disability laws, but they're not being followed and they're not being enforced. A lot of what we do is enforcing clear law. Now, we try to change law too, but there's a big gap still between what people are entitled to by law and what they get. And we're trying to reduce or eliminate that gap.
Yeah. Employment discrimination, also of a huge note these days too?
It's an enormous problem now, and I think the pandemic really heightened it. We talked about essential workers, people who we rely on for our continued existence. And very often those people were people who were underpaid, who didn't have access to medical insurance, who were forced to expose themselves to danger so that the rest of us can continue to survive. And there's so many people, we deal with home health care workers, and we depend on them for people with disabilities, for our older relatives. And yet we have a case where people are expected to work 24 hours and they're paid for 12 hours. And that pay is very low. So there's this gap. The people should be allowed to make a living wage when they work full time, or in the case of some of our clients, multiple jobs. But they're not.
Right. When we find cases of employment discrimination, and we know that's huge, what are pretty much the foundation for this employment discrimination? Because I hear people talk, there are a lot of cases out there. Are we finding like there's some common themes among employment discrimination?
There are a range of cases. There are cases where there's pretty much express discrimination. Mm-hmm. We have a case now that is Bronx-based of different pay rates for Applebee's in the South Bronx versus Manhattan. And in the South Bronx, where the people who work there are mostly black or brown, they get $10 an hour. And in the areas in like Times Square, where the workers are more white, they get $15 an hour. And so it's hard to come up with an explanation for that. But a part of it is that there are systems that take advantage of groups of people, whether it's agricultural workers, the home health care workers I was talking about, where they are denied benefits, where they are paid less, and where that affects not only them, but their family and their future and their future family. The work we do is intergenerational. It has an impact that will be felt long in the future. And it's one of the reasons why there is still a significant wealth gap between black and brown families and white families. And in some cases, an extraordinary difference. White families having 20 or 30 or 40 times the wealth as a black family. That makes a difference about where you can go to college, where you live, whether you can start a business. And so we're trying to even the playing field.
Yeah. When you have cases of employment discrimination, it's obviously taken a while for it to mature and come to end up on your doorstep, I should say. But on a day-to-day level, people are trying to find out what are my rights and how do I go about really speaking, because sometimes you feel like you're up against that brick wall when it comes to your employer and you don't want to say anything. You don't want to challenge the system because this is how I live and this is how I survive and I can't. So what advice do you have, and what can people do when they know they're being exploited in the workforce to really get to a place where they can take some legal action?
We are one of a lot of organizations that deal with fair employment practices, and so reaching out to the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, Economic Justice Cities, Fair Economy here in New York, us. There are all sorts of people who could tell you what your rights are and can help protect you. In that case I was describing about Applebee's, the person who complained to us, we filed a complaint, and then that person was fired because he filed a complaint. And that violates the law when you retaliate against someone because they oppose a discriminatory practice. So we're representing that person in those cases. You know, we tend not to take individual cases. The overwhelming majority of our case are large number of plaintiffs, but we could guide people to where they can get individual help.
Yeah. You talk about the economy, talk about trying to make it, right? And, you know, we know that the economy is in challenge right now, but low-wage workers are a big reality these days. People who are really dealing with the fact of, you know, being underpaid,
Right.
And exploited. How do you go about dealing with that from a legal perspective?
Well, sometimes we enforce the existing law. Sometimes we move to bring new cases or to create new law. We have an effort going on now called 13 Forward. And as you know, the 13th Amendment, which prohibits slavery, has an exception for people who are incarcerated. And so we are working to end the exploitation of those people by making sure that they're paid a fair wage, or that the kinds of systems where people work for pennies a day are eliminated. We look for things where wealth is being extracted from low-income communities, which tend to be black or brown communities, and we try to end those practices. We've been doing a case up in Buffalo for years, but Buffalo was balancing its city budget by imposing fines and fees on people after there were traffic stops set up in black neighborhoods, and they would charge you a fee for having windows that were too dark, and then give you one for every window, so that you had to pay thousands of dollars. And what we found out is that the budget contained fines and fees that the city passed. So they were using that as a way of raising money, and they were raising that money on the backs of black and brown people. And that happens all over the country in one form or another. So we're fighting to end that. And the one thing that I'd like to say is that the things that are being done to save money by underpaying people, by not providing them benefits, ends up costing us multiple times more later on. So we're hurting people now, and that's important.
Right.
But we're hurting everyone. If you don't fund the opportunity for people to have healthy environments, for people to have access to food, to people to have access for accommodations, that has an impact. You'll be paying more later by higher health costs, incarceration costs, all of these things. So it's a really foolish economy to underpay people now, to not provide safe environments.
Which brings me to the question of, how do you tackle government accountability?
Well, very often in court. I mean, we are maybe most of our work are suing government offices that aren't living up to their responsibilities, where we have cases against the New York State Department of Labor. We have cases against human resources offices in New York City. We have cases against health organizations throughout the country. And we're saying, you need to live up. You are obligated to provide these services, and you're not doing it.
For yourself, what's it like now? Because I know during COVID, we've had this conversation on this platform, another platform of a show that I host, where we talk about court being inundated right now. So much so that almost justice is even more delayed because of COVID and the backlog. For what are you seeing inside the courtroom? Are we seeing any progress? Are you still finding that things are extremely backlogged?
Things are backlogged, but there are other things that you can do, and we find ourselves, you know, a lot is achieved by people doing local organizing, and we urge people to take steps to make sure that their local governments and their state governments are living up to their obligations. And so we've been working with a number of extremely effective organizations that have been putting pressure on government to respond. And we'll always be there to back them up with a lawsuit if necessary. But you have to recognize there are a lot of ways that you can proceed, and we try to help people find those ways and to offer one option with litigation as well as assistance with legislation and things like that.
What should we, the viewer, be paying attention to these days?
What? I'm sorry.
What should we, the viewer, and the public, really be paying attention to these days that we can lend our voice to?
I think that there was a narrative about public benefits for a long time, really started, probably 40 years ago or 50 years ago, that there are welfare queens or people taking advantage of these public benefits. And I think we need to pay attention to the fact that there are these real needs that people have, that these public benefits are safety net programs, and in fact most people don't stay on them for their whole lives, but use the opportunity to get their lives together and then end up being in a better economic situation later on. So we need to be aware of the issues of difficulty in access to public benefits, unfair exploitation of labor, environmental issues that differentially affect communities of color, and that's something that's going to be growing as global warming continues. If you look at who is hit hardest, both in this country and in the world, it is lower income and particularly black and brown communities. And I think that kind of fairness is something we should be paying attention to, and we don't hear as many discussions as we need to hear about the people who are most harshly affected by what's going on now.
Yeah, we got to leave it there. Dennis Parker, Executive Director, the National Center, I should say, for Law and Economic Justice. Thank you so much for being with us.
Great to be with you.
You got to come back.
I would love to come back.
We have to unpack some more stuff. We can't unpack this all just in a segment like this, so just want to let you know that.
All right, I'll
We'll
be
have to
back.
All right, listen. All right, taking a quick break. Guess what? We'll be back with more coming up right after this.